Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's conference, Environmental Justice, Making Policy Real. My name is Dr. Jacquelyn Burrell, and I'm a recent graduate of Bastyr University, and I will be your MC for the day. And it is truly my privilege and my pleasure on behalf of the organizers and sponsors to welcome you here today. There is also a closed captioning feature that you'll have to turn on yourselves if you would like, and it's located on the bottom bar of Zoom near participants, chat, and reactions. And if you need any help with that, please private message one of the names with the trees. So one of the intersections between environmental justice and medicine are the determinants of health. And these are those factors that determine the state of our internal health, and it's incredibly influenced by our environment. Washington State, along with the rest of the US, has marginalized communities that are set to face the most significant impact of the climate crisis. So what can we do about it? Well, that's what we're here today for. So prepare yourself to learn, be excited, get inspired about a variety of advocacy efforts and policy changes that support the well-being of individuals, communities, and our environment. Again, it's so wonderful to see so many of you here today, and I'd like to extend a gracious and inclusive welcome to all of you. Next, I'd like to introduce to you one of our health and climate crisis organizers, Dr. Kathleen Lumiere.
Thank you, Jacquelyn, for that great introduction and just setting the stage for the really important work that we're doing here. Your presence is absolutely vital. So many hearts, hands, minds, and computers go into making an event like this. So I have to say the people that I've met doing this work have been pretty wonderful. It's been my great good fortune to have co-organizers like fellow faculty member Lev Elsenschwab and Bastyr admissions advisor Daniel Van Arsdale, our community champion. Jackie Julian, Ben Young, and Anthony Greene from the Communities of Color Coalition, and many more smart and caring colleagues for the Emerging Health in the Climate Crisis program. I also want to acknowledge the kindness and generosity of the presenters from the Department of Health. Elise Rasmussen, Sierra Rotakhina, Jennifer Sable, and Ellie Ertl, most of whom have been activated for the COVID response and who are doing this climate equity on top of that. Thank you. Thanks to Guillermo Rogel.
I think I just got things set up, right?
And thanks to our Bastyr administrators, Vice President Dave Rule, who supported the Health and Climate Project from the outset, our marketing folks, Vice President Jeannie Galloway and Rose Walker, and importantly, our new president, Devin Byrd, who had the vision to see clearly the need for this academic and community partnership to address a significant aspect of a crisis that affects or will affect nearly all life on this good earth. It is my honor to introduce Dr. Devin Byrd, the president of Bastyr University, who, as the highest ranking member of one of the communities hosting this event, will now give the land acknowledgement. Dr. Devin Byrd.
Thank you very much, Doctor. Hello, everyone, and welcome. We had a fantastic group collaborating to put the conference together. My name is Devin Byrd, and I'd like to share just a little bit about my background. I'm originally from the East Coast, having grown up in North Carolina, and most recently moved from California prior to moving to Seattle this past summer. I'm also a part of a large extended family from both my father and mother's connections. My family origins include African, Cherokee, as well as French descent. My wife and I have known each other for 32 years and have also been married for almost 25. We have 3 children, 2 of whom are in college, a senior and a junior, and we also have a 3rd child who is 13 years of age. I am truly honored to serve as the president of Bastyr University and also very humbled to have been asked to share this land acknowledgement on behalf of the university and our event partners. We wanted to start today by acknowledging that our meeting is being hosted on the traditional lands of the Coast Salish people, whose spiritual connection to these lands forms the foundations of their ways of being. Let us consider how we make space for their voices to be heard and how we can humbly build relationships with these knowledge keepers. To that end, Bastyr University also looks to increase our relationships with local Indigenous communities. And we've begun to explore how we're able to do so internally through the creation of a recent initiative called the Bastyr Community Initiative. One element of this initiative is called community engagement. And it is through this endeavor that we will seek to gain an understanding of how we can become more readily connected. And we really look forward to that opportunity. If you will, please join me in a moment of reflection as we consider the complete history of Indigenous peoples whose deep connection to the land can teach us much about the intersections of climate and health. We appreciate the time that you spend in reflection. If you would like to learn more about the land where you live, work, and play, I'd invite you to visit the nativeland.ca link that Lev will put in the chat. I hope you enjoyed today's sessions and would like to turn things over now to Jacquelyn. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that land acknowledgement and opening, Dr. Byrd. That was, that always hits in the heart, doesn't it? So next up we have Anthony Greene. Anthony Greene is stepping in for Jackie Julian today. So Anthony Greene is Program Director at Communities of Color Coalition.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Jacquelyn, for that introduction. I'm really thrilled to be here with you all today. As Jacquelyn mentioned, my name is Anthony Greene. I am the program coordinator for the Communities of Color Coalition based in Edmonds. We are a grassroots organization that tries to center the needs of the BIPOC community and the historically marginalized groups. And we do that through a two-pronged approach. We do that through direct service and policy change. So I'm glad to be meeting with you all today. All of us are members of overlapping communities, families, race and ethnic groups, professions, and other concerns. Here today are people from communities dedicated to the public good. As you know, we have teaching and learning partners from C3, from local tribal nations, people from climate action families and other activist groups, churches, community members dedicated to healthcare access, like Integrative Medicine for All, Project Access North, Pacific Islander Health Board of Washington, Behavioral Health Resources, Harborview, and Swedish Medical Centers. We also have educators and students from the Snohomish and Cedar Rapids districts, the University of Washington, Cascadia and Bellevue Colleges, and Bastyr University, and many more. Lots of communities with shared purposes, lots of knowledge, lots of points of view here today. You'll have the opportunities to share some of your insights in breakout rooms, questions and comments in the chat, and at the end in a culminating discussion, the community session. As you listen and learn and participate for the next few hours, please be open to inspiration, yours and that of others. Hopefully this is going to go somewhere, namely towards policy, education, and action about climate and health and environmental justice. Thank you all today.
Thank you so much for that. Let's get started. First up, we'll start with the HEAL Act and the Environmental Justice Council. So leading this, we have Guillermo Rogel, who is a professional lobbyist in Washington State. Guillermo currently works for Front and Centered on the policy team, advancing state legislation and budgets that advance environmental justice and move our communities closer to a just transition. Prior to Front and Centered, Guillermo organized students in Washington State and California to push for a more affordable and equitable system of higher education. We'll also have joining Elise Rasmussen. As a former teacher serving Black and Brown students living in low-income communities, and as a Black person growing up in Minneapolis's Black community, Elise knows how a neighborhood can determine access to quality education, healthy food, economic opportunity, adequate and affordable housing, as well as clean air, water, and soil. After teaching, she returned to school for her master's degrees in public health and urban planning with the desire to tackle the root causes that perpetuate health inequities and to think upstream about creating healthy environments for all. Upon graduating, Elise managed Washington's Environmental Justice Task Force and helped to write the HEAL Act, new Washington state legislation, which makes many of the task force's recommendations state law. Elise recently transitioned to a new role as the Climate Equity Coordinator at the Washington State Department of Health, where she works at the intersection of climate, environmental, health, and racial justice. And then next, joining those two wonderful humans are Sierra Rotakhina. So Sierra grew up in a small rural town where the beautiful assets of mountain living, resilience, strong sense of community, a culture of taking care of your neighbors, and the beauty of the environment existed alongside poverty, a lack of access to resources and jobs, and an economy dependent on outdoor adventure tourism. Growing up surrounded by disparities in income, health, and access to resources led Sierra to pursue her master's degree in public health and to dedicate her career to integrating equity and justice into state government policies, programs, and research. Sierra is now the manager for the Environmental Justice Council created by the HEAL Act.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm first, right, Elise and Sierra? Okay. Well, thank you so much, Jacquelyn, for that introduction. And thank you all for being here on this Saturday morning. One of the things I think that's really exciting about the HEAL Act now is that it is law. And I think a lot of folks have been talking about this issue of environmental justice in Washington State for a few years now as legislation. You know, like environmental justice and its advocacy has existed for a really long time, but I'm really happy just now that, well, Elise and I went through the process or the trauma of the political legislative session. And, you know, we got to really see how legislators are trying to understand the issue of environmental justice and now how the state and its state agencies are going to be enacting environmental justice in its work. So all of these presentations where we're debriefing the HEAL Act, you know, and getting to connect with people and cover the work that's going to happen over the next few years, I think is always super rewarding because we get to kind of see the fruits of our labor. So I'm really happy that Elise reached out. So thank you all for being here. I'm going to share my screen because I have a presentation to get to you. Where I wanted to start was just a little bit about Front and Centered. So I encourage you all, if you want to learn more about us, to go to our website. But just a little bit about our coalition. We are a coalition of 70 members in Washington State who are rooted in communities of color and low-income communities and indigenous communities in Washington State who really are on the front lines of climate and environmental change. And we want to make sure that as the state and different localities are thinking about addressing climate, that they have our communities front and centered in those policy solutions, and that they are doing this active consultation and outreach to our communities when coming up with policy solutions. So this is just a little bit about us. I could spend a couple of hours just talking about our work, but I think where I just really wanted to focus was our work really is rooted in the communities who are on the front line. And the HEAL Act was one of those products that came out of our communities. Okay. Does this look good to everyone? At least Sierra, cool. Okay, so the Healthy Environment for All Act, it is also known as the HEAL Act, but this was Senate Bill 5141 that was introduced this last legislative session. and the sponsor was Senator Rebecca Saldana. She is down in the 37th Legislative District in Seattle. So just a little bit of context there. So I really wanted to talk about the essence and the spirit of the HEAL Act and where it came from, and then go into a little bit about what it is and transition to Elise and Sierra, who I think will get more into the technical aspects of the HEAL Act and how it's being implemented. But really high level, our communities really wanted to push the message that where you live, your zip code, your language ability shouldn't determine how healthy and safe you are. But tragically, we know that there are communities who have a lot less resources, who live on the front lines and are exposed to all of these different levels of pollution, which have an impact on their health. So it's often low-income people, communities of color, and linguistically isolated people who really pay with their well-being and shortened lives. So I think sometimes a really good way of defining what the work that you're doing is kind of going back and looking at the opposite. So what is environmental injustice? So for us, we know that although we're trying to shoot for a community and a society where you live and your zip code doesn't impact your health, it very much does have an impact. So folks who have less education or healthcare have poor overall health. And we can see this just by looking at some of the data that we have through our environmental health disparities map, which we'll cover later. But I wanted to focus in on the King County example. So if you look at one of the King County reports that is out there on environmental justice and health, there can be a difference in life expectancy by 10 years just based on where in King County you are. So for example, if you live in South Park or near Georgetown, your life expectancy is a lot different than folks who might live on Mercer Island or Bellevue. So the life expectancy there can be a really big difference of up to 10 years. So this is what we mean when we're talking about environmental injustice. So I want to get into the definition of environmental justice that is now in statute. And this was done through the work of the Environmental Justice Task Force, which I'll get into a little bit, but I think to really set the context for this presentation and for the day, this is the law, or this is the definition that is not now in law in Washington. So I'm going to go ahead and read it, but it's up there on the screen if you want to take a look too. But the definition of environmental justice is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. This includes using an intersectional lens to address disproportionate environmental and health impacts by prioritizing highly impacted communities, equitably distributing resources and benefits, and eliminating harm. So sometimes the question gets asked, how is this definition different from the federal definition? And it really is this second sentence right here that is underlined. The Environmental Justice Task Force and community members really wanted to place an emphasis on harm that has already happened and making sure that we are repairing that harm that has happened. Elise, anything there that you want to add on the definition to the task force?
Yeah, thanks, Guillermo. I will just add, and I think Guillermo alluded to this, is that this was really created in partnership with communities across the state, and hearing from them over the course of about 12 months about what does EJ look like and mean for you, and then being able to take and synthesize what we were hearing and put it into this definition. And it took several months. So it's now just very exciting to see this community-rooted definition that's now in our state law.
Thank you, Elise. So I wanted to get into the origins of HEAL, so you all understand a lot of the work and I would say emotional labor that went into developing the HEAL Act. So as I mentioned at the beginning, environmental justice has always been around. I think you can really point to some movements really in the 70s and the 80s that were really trying to center environmental justice. So that work has always happened. But the work really to create front and centered and to create the Environmental Justice Task Force started in around 2014. This is where environmental justice advocates, communities of color, really saw that the conversation about climate and environmental change was missing a really crucial voice, and that was the voice of frontline communities who really were bearing the brunt of climate change and pollution. So this is when groups really start to meet. Front and Center then starts, developing partnerships, not just with communities of color, but with different government institutions, academic institutions, to come up with a set of data that we can really point to environmental injustice that's taking place around the state. This is where the partnership was created with UW, with a few state departments, including Health, Ecology, and the Clean Air Agency. And this group really helped propel the development of the Environmental Health Disparities Map, which is referenced a ton through the HELAC. And Elise and Sierra will talk a little bit more about how the Environmental Health Disparities Map works, and how you all can probably look at your own communities and see what are the different determinants of health in your communities. So in 2019, in the legislative session, this is when the HEAL Act was first introduced. It was ambitious for its time, but it made it pretty far through the legislative process. But oftentimes, when the legislature doesn't want to take action on a bill, or they think they need a little bit more time to pass a bill, they will create a task force. Task forces are used, well, for a few different reasons. But I think in this case, it really helped because, for as ambitious as the law was, the state really wanted to take the time to make sure that all stakeholders were engaged, that state agencies were in the mix and in that conversation. So in 2019, there was a budget proviso. It was about almost $400,000 to create this task force so that they could meet over the course of a year and come up with recommendations on implementing environmental justice in Washington. So through the course of 2019 and 2020, this is when the task force met, when Front and Center was hosting community listening sessions. And the final report was put out, I want to say in October or November of last year. So through that task force, we were able to have this solid set of recommendations, which now Front and Center community members and agencies can say, look, we went through the process, through the stakeholder process. We included state agencies, we included community. We now have this community definition of environmental justice. So, we started trying to pass that law. The thing about legislation in Washington or just anywhere is that you have an idea of what the HEAL Act will be, but it gets thrown into the blender of legislative process. So now you have, more than 150 legislative members who are like, wait, I have this thought, or like state agencies have this thought, the business community. So you go through this, it really is a blender of just trying to find out what are the different stakeholders who maybe wanted to be included, who didn't feel included, what's going to be the cost of the bill. So we ended up with a really solid bill at the end of session, a little different than what we had anticipated, but we're excited now to see that it's going to be fully implemented. I think this is going to be my last slide, but just really high level, what we wanted to accomplish with the HEAL Act was, one, make sure that there was a definition for environmental justice in state law. We got that accomplished. We wanted to make sure that agencies were incorporating environmental justice into the decision-making process. So EJ wasn't something that was sprinkled on at the end. It was something that was really baked in to the agency decision-making process in Washington. Also make sure that agencies were accountable to communities and that we created an environmental justice council that was really for us community members with the lived experience to help provide recommendations, and make sure that there's consistent and accessible pathways for communities to be involved. And I really want to emphasize it's proactively reaching out to community, not after the fact. So yeah, I'll leave it there. And I'll turn it over to Elise and Sierra.
Thanks so much, Guillermo. Really appreciate that. And as Sierra is pulling up this presentation, I'll just bring some attention to what Kathleen is posting in the chat. Just please put in any sort of questions that you have. We definitely will have a Q&A following Sierra and my presentation. And after that, we'll get a chance to get further into discussion. So if you have questions, if you have comments, please don't be shy, put them in the chat. We'll get plenty of time to discuss. So good morning, everyone. And thanks again, Guillermo, for that really great overview and context setting. I think that's going to make what Sierra and I have to say resonate a lot more. So really appreciate what you just offered. So Sierra and I are going to get a little bit more into the weeds around what environmental justice, or what the HEAL Act, I should say, is really about. So again, my name is Elise Rasmussen. I use she, her pronouns. I am the Climate Justice Coordinator at the Washington State Department of Health. And Sierra, I'll pass it to you to introduce yourself.
Thank you so much, Elise. I'm Sierra Rotakhina. I also use she, her pronouns, and I'm the manager for the Environmental Justice Council. And I'll just say quickly before we get started, the Environmental Justice Council is an independent community advisory body. So while it's staffed through the Department of Health, like my email address is a DOH email, and I technically work for the Department of Health, me and my team as staff to the council we report to the council, this community advisory body. We're accountable to the council, who is accountable to community. So I really see myself as reporting to the co-chairs and council members of that council, which is important because we'll talk about this in a little bit, but the council is meant to keep the state agencies, including the Department of Health, accountable. So just want to share that because I think that's a really important element here that gives the council the ability to really amplify community voice. Thank you, Elise.
Yeah, that's really a great point. And we're going to get definitely, Sierra's going to talk a lot more about what the council is responsible for and will be doing. So look forward to that. So next slide, please. Just an overview of what we're going to talk about in our presentation for the next about 20-ish minutes is, Guillermo went over what environmental justice is, and so I hope you got a little bit more context there. And if not, if you want to continue to discuss that, that's definitely something that we can talk about during the Q&A and the discussion. But we're really going to spend time right now doing an overview of the HEAL Act and then talking about how these four groups, communities, the EJ Council, the EJ Interagency Work Group, and state agencies, how these four groups are going to be working together to implement the HEAL Act. So we'll be laying out what those four groups are about and kind of their roles. Like I said, then we'll have some Q&A time and discussion. Next slide. So before we get started, I really wanted to, before we get started in diving into like what the HEAL Act is about, we really wanted to also take some time to do some context setting. So Guillermo had mentioned in his presentation the environmental health disparities map, and that's prominently featured in the HEAL Act and is one of the most important tools that we use in Washington state government to inform which communities we need to be engaging with and prioritizing when working to address environmental and also climate justice. And so just before we really launch into this, I also want to say, like, towards the end of today's session, definitely stick around for the whole time because we have an activity planned where you'll get to learn more about this map and also get to play around with it and see for yourself kind of how this map works. So that definitely looking forward to that later on this morning. So just a little bit about the map. The map ranks different census tracts. So you can see here all the green outlines. Each of those outlines is a census tract. And so in more rural areas, the census tracts are larger because we have fewer people there, but in more dense urban areas, the census tracts are much smaller. And so what it does is that it ranks all these census tracts across the state using 19 different indicators that communities across the state identified as being really important in measuring progress towards environmental justice and identifying any EJ issues. So communities that are ranked 1 or are the lightest color on the map have the least amount of environmental health risk. Communities that are ranked 10 or the darkest purple are communities or census tracts that are have the most risk in terms of environmental health disparities. So next slide, please. And I'm just going to pull up this one sort of graph. So this graph here is using the underlying data that populates the map. So using these data, we are looking at life expectancy across different ranks. So on the x-axis at the bottom, you can see 1 through 10. Those are those ranked. So 1, again, least risk, 10, most environmental health disparities risk. Before I launch into like talking about this graph, I want to first say that many of us may be living in census tracts that are ranked high, like 8, 9, or 10. And I want to be really clear that this map is only 19 indicators. It doesn't show the community assets that are in communities that are ranked 9 and 10. It doesn't show the social cohesion, the community resilience, all of these factors that go into making a strong community. They're not all included in this map. So I want to be really clear that because just because you may live in a census tract that's ranked 9 or 10 doesn't mean despair. There's a lot of strength in those communities that are highly ranked on this map. But there are also issues that we need to address head on. And so one of those is life expectancy. So using these data, we can see that there's nearly a 6-year difference in life expectancy across the state from census tracts that are ranked 1 to census tracts that are ranked 10. So census tracts, people who are living in census tracts that are ranked 1 are associated with a longer lifespan. Also, just so you know, folks who are living experiencing poverty are overrepresented in census tracts that are ranked 7 and above. The poverty rate in census tract 10 is double that of the poverty rate in census tract 1. And that's important because environmental justice is about low-income people. That's one of the main factors. And then secondly, environmental justice is about race, like really looking at race, because we know that race is the leading predictor for where environmental hazards are located in our country and even in our state. So these data show that census tracts, and I have other graphs for this, but for the sake of time today, I'm just gonna say this verbally, that we know that census tracts that are ranked 10 have higher proportions of Black, Indigenous, and people of color than the state average. And that Black Washingtonians in particular are 10 times more likely to live in census tracts that are ranked 10 than census tracts that are ranked 1. So that gives you an idea of who is living kind of in these different census tracts. Next slide. And I think I'll pass it to you, Sierra.
Thank you so much, Elise. I do this work every day and look at this data all the time, and it still like gets me in the gut hearing that, because the injustice is just, it's so wrong, and there's such a history of it, and there's so much work we need to do to fix it. And that kind of pulls us into this idea of working together, which is the kind of the theme Elise and I want to pull through our presentation, is that, you know, this is really, in order to achieve environmental justice, it really needs to be communities working together, particularly those overburdened communities that Elise is talking about that have been impacted by these environmental injustices, and the state agencies and the Environmental Justice Council, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a minute, and the an environmental justice interagency work group. We really need to be working together to achieve environmental justice through the HEAL Act. So quickly, just want to touch base on the importance of centering community in this environmental justice work. Without communities at the center of this work, really, you know, giving state agencies the guidance and the direction that we need to go, this work will not be successful. So I just want to call out a few places where the HEAL Act itself and the work that's happening is trying to center communities. So the first is the definition of environmental justice, which Guillermo shared, which one of the primary pillars of that is meaningful community engagement and involvement. Another piece of that is the intent of the HEAL Act, which is to address these environmental justices in communities. These are communities experiencing these things. The Environmental Justice Council, as I mentioned, is a community advisory board or a community advisory council. So really it is, you know, that's really emphasizing that this council is going to be community voice, and not only just the members being members of the community, but also the way that the council interacts with impacted communities. And really, it's just the responsibility of state government to center communities in this work. State government exists to serve the communities, to serve people, and we're really just not doing our work if we're not being led by the community's voice or voices. And it's just essential for HEAL success. So we can't be successful in implementing HEAL and achieving environmental justice if we don't center community voice in this work. And we really run the risk actually of making these injustices worse, because that's kind of the history, right? Was not letting community guide this work, not centering community voice, and making a lot of policy and program decisions that created these injustices in the first place. So really super essential that community is at the center of this work. Quickly, I want to touch on state agencies. So the HEAL Act names 7 state agencies that are required to do this work. It's the Puget Sound Partnership, Department of Agriculture, Department of Health, Department of Natural Resources, Department of Transportation, Department of Ecology, and Department of Commerce. So these are the state agencies that are required to implement the HEAL Act. But we have a number of agencies who have acknowledged also that their policy decisions and their programs impact environmental injustice and are engaging in the work in some way, even though they're not technically required to do so. Those agencies are the Department of Fish and Wildlife, Washington State Recreation and Conservation Office, the Attorney General's Office, and the State Board of Health. And I'll just say quickly, because Elise is going to get much more into the details on this, but just as a quick overview, the HEAL Act outlines a number of obligations for state agencies. They're adopting community engagement plans, incorporating EJ into strategic plans, incorporating environmental justice into budget and funding decisions, and then conducting EJ assessments, which, like I said, Elise will go much more into detail on those. But I just want to point out there's this arrow across the bottom of this graphic that says the Environmental Justice Interagency Work Group. I'm going to talk more about that in a minute, but I just want to highlight that this collaboration of the state agencies required to do this work or opting in to do this work is just one way to make sure our state agencies are collaborating as one government to do this work. And I'm going to pass it back to Elise.
Thanks, Sarah. So now we're going to get a little bit more into the weeds. And this is just like a little bit of a snippet. And I want to also say that the next few slides here, we have up at the top kind of the desired outcome or like kind of the intent. And that's really what I'm going to be focusing on when I go through these different sections of the bill. But in the lighter teal green box below is the actual like language that's included in the HEAL Act, just so that you have it as a reference, because we really think it's important for you all to be equipped with the language that's in the bill. And so if that is something that is of interest to you, we do have a resource slide at the end where you'll be able to just have a hyperlink right to the bill and search for this language as well, if you want to get more into the weeds here, and if you're a policy wonk like me. So this, one of the first like elements of this plan is that each agency that's named in the HEAL Act that Sierra just went over is going to create an agency-wide community engagement plan that specifically is focused on how to meaningfully engage communities that are most overburdened by pollution and populations that are most affected by pollution. And I want to be really clear that this is the first deadline named in the HEAL Act, and that was really intentional. That was because as we were writing the HEAL Act, we wanted to make sure that agencies didn't get too far ahead of community and really took the time to think about how they're going to be engaging communities as they go through HEAL Act implementation, but also across their other agency programs and policies as well. And so I think that's really important. And one other thing I want to say about this is that the Environmental Justice Task Force thought a lot about this, provided a ton of recommendations around community engagement, as well as included a guidance document in the appendix of the report, which you'll have a link to at the end of this presentation as well. That is a guidance document for agencies about what they need to be including in their plans to help them meaningfully engage communities. And so agencies are already starting to work on their engagement plans and will get feedback and guidance from the Environmental Justice Council on these plans. And so agencies have already started talking about these plans as living documents because, you know, even though it's the first deadline, like they'll just have to continue to work on that and continue to refine how are we going to improve our community engagement, using council and community feedback. Next slide, please. So another part of the HEAL Act is that each of those named agencies are going to have to include environmental justice into their strategic plans. And this is really important because this is a way to embed EJ at the highest levels of an agency and infuse environmental justice principles throughout an agency's goals, missions, strategies to get to their goals, right? It is a way to hold agencies accountable to these environmental justice principles. So it will be very exciting to see how these agencies come up with how they're going to prioritize EJ at the highest levels to really influence the systems and the structures within that agency to promote EJ and make environmental justice a central goal of their agency's work. Next slide. Another part of the HEAL Act is around budget and funding decisions. So the HEAL Act really names the importance of equitably distributing funding and any sort of benefits that specifically would promote community and population resilience, promote health, and improve the quality of life. And so this is really getting at the fact that for so long, through historically racist policies like redlining and you know, segregation, residential segregation, we have seen that like specific communities have been targeted by environmental injustices and also have been underinvested in over decades and decades and decades. And this is really an attempt to redress that and say, you know, we're going to focus on prioritizing these communities. So in a sense, this policy is really acting to be anti-racist and anti-oppressionist in how we implement this bill. And that's really the intent behind this piece. I'll also note that the federal government has what's called the Justice 40 initiative, which does a lot of the same thing. So at the federal level, they are working to get environmental and climate funding to communities that are quote unquote disadvantaged and make sure that those communities are getting the resources and funding that they need to be resilient in the face of climate change and also to address environmental injustices in those communities. So it's awesome to see in Washington that this is happening at a state level, but also a federal level. Next slide, please. And then this slide, this is probably one of the more technical aspects of the HEAL Act that will take a lot of time and iteration to figure out how to do it best. But what I will say is that this is the environmental justice assessment. So using an environmental justice guidance, agencies are going to create these environmental justice assessments that they will use prior to taking any significant action. So what's a significant action? Well, it is an action that agencies take that may have the potential to negatively impact a community that is already overburdened by pollution, or may have a negative impact to populations that are already most vulnerable to the effects of pollution. And so it is a chance for agencies to stop before they make a major action and say, how could this action potentially negatively affect these different communities? And I think that what's important to acknowledge here is that there are certainly folks within agencies who are already thinking about this, but also this makes it so that this is an agency-wide way to operationalize environmental justice across agencies and across state government. So it's no longer piecemeal. It's something that all agencies have to do. So some examples of some significant agency actions are new grant and loan programs, big transportation and infrastructure projects that could definitely negatively impact communities. And then also if an agency wants the legislature to make a policy change, an agency would need to do an EJ assessment on how that policy change could maybe possibly negatively impact a community. And so there's all these kind of higher level actions that agencies are always taking. And this is really a moment for agencies to pause and say, wait a minute, how could this possibly negatively impact before we move forward? And I think one thing that's also really important to mention is that the Environmental Justice Council that Sierra is going to talk about in a second is going to be instrumental in helping agencies figure out what should be a part of that assessment. And so it's really going to be essential for community voice to come into that process to say, you need to consider X, Y, and Z before you take action. And that's a huge part of what communities can do. So definitely be tuning into these council meetings. Definitely encourage you to give public comment. Definitely encourage you to stay active and involved, because there's really a lot of transformational work that's happening on the state level that we're flipping it on its head and giving community power to say what it is that you all need. The last thing I'll say on this environmental justice assessment piece is that currently there are a finite set of actions that are included in the HEAL Act for what these significant agency actions are. But there is definitely the opportunity to potentially expand to a larger set of actions. As we get rolling with HEAL implementation, the council will also be recommending to state government maybe some additional actions that should be considered to be required to take these assessments before they make action. So I hope that was a little bit clear. It's pretty a technical piece, but if there are any questions about that, we can definitely talk more about that during the discussion or Q&A. And I'll pass it back to you, Sierra.
Thanks, Elise. We have a few questions in the comment. Do we want to just save them all to the end and get through the content, or do we want to address some of them as we go?
Up to you, because I'm looking at them now. So is there any that you feel, Sierra, like you'd want to address right now, or you think I should address right now?
I can hit on a couple of them since I had a chance to read them as you were talking, just because of, we want this to be interactive. So the more we can create that dialogue, if people wanted to talk about one area, we're happy to kind of focus on that. So I'll just say, there was a question in the chat saying, Sierra, I'm curious what accountability there is between the different groups working together. Definitely hop on to clarify your question if I'm not getting at what you're asking, but I think that there's several pieces there. So a lot of that is it's baked into the HEAL Act. With what Elise is talking about is that there is these requirements for the agencies. One of those requirements being to engage community and center community in this work. And the EJ Council is developing or will be developing metrics to and assessing the state agencies in their progress of actually doing this work. And so the EJ Council is as that conduit between community and state agencies is supposed to make sure that the agencies are staying accountable to community and also to those metrics. And so there's a concrete way to actually measure that, and it's not just subjective. But I will pause there and see, am I getting at your question, or were you looking for something different? And you should be able to unmute yourself and ask if you want to.
Yeah, sorry. Hi, that was me, Krista June. Yes, you nailed it. That's exactly what I'm wondering. I said groups, but I meant agencies, I guess. And I would just layer onto that question about the training piece, because it seems like, environmental justice, you really need to do some work understanding environmental justice itself and what that means in the local area, and then understanding the disparities. And then if you're tasking all of these different agencies with coming up with plans, I was just curious, I know how spending can be. They're not just going to hire a bunch of experts for this work. So I was just curious what sort of training components go into that so that they are empowered to come up with these plans.
That's a great question. I'll start, but Elise, please jump in and add. So there was funding, there was a fiscal note on this bill. And so now that it's in statute, there is funding for the various state agencies. I think almost all the agencies would say it wasn't enough, but every agency has been able to hire at least one person. Some are hiring more, and they are focusing those positions on people who have community engagement experience, environmental justice expertise, really trying to get the job announcements out into the communities who have been doing this work for so long. So hopefully there will just be, the building up of those expertise within the agencies. And then the agencies are also collaborating, working together to say, how do we do internal education? Because having a person or a handful of people with expertise on this is not enough to create the culture shift that needs to happen within these agencies. So there's also a lot of work going on within the interagency work group of, okay, how do we do train the trainer? How do we sort of start to create this expertise throughout the agencies? But yeah, it's a huge lift, and starting with a handful of people is not enough, but it is, at least the experts are getting integrated, and the community members are experts too, obviously, right? So how do we learn from community how to teach other staff? And then there was a question about local government. June, does this act have a way to get local communities, counties, and cities engaged in this work as well? It seems that much of this work needs to be enacted at a local level. I think that that's a great point. The language of the HEAL Act really is focused on state government, though a lot of local government is governed by policies at the state level a lot of the time. So I think there are opportunities for that to trickle down in that way, but really looking into this local governments themselves, I don't think it's totally captured by HEAL. But I would like to Elise and Guillermo to talk about the intent there.
Yeah, I will say that I have met with folks from folks from the port who asked the same question, but they ask it in a way where they wish it had impacted them. So I think they do want it, which is super interesting, right? Because when we were proposing this legislation, we were saying, you should be doing some of this work already. It shouldn't seem like a pretty novel idea that, hey, we should probably check in with the people most impacted before we make these decisions, before we move on with this project. But at Front and Center, we're thinking, how can we do this for the economy? What are some decisions that are being made about our state's economy that aren't centering the folks who are most impacted? So we're thinking about new ways to implement this in different sectors of Washington, maybe how this can trickle down into local and county. But yeah, that's a good question that I think a lot of folks would be interested in.
We'll cover a few more slides and then go back to catch any questions that come up. So keep putting your questions into the chat. This is great. We really did want to dialogue. So there's a ton of text on this slide. I'm not intending folks to read it now. Again, Elise had mentioned we want this to be a resource, this slide deck, so we can share it out. But just wanted to take a moment to really emphasize the importance of tribal consultation. And it's explicitly written into the HEAL Act to keep the agencies accountable for that. And I'll just say there's a need to be doing engagement with tribes and with Indigenous communities at every step of the way. And then there are also really explicit places in the HEAL Act where the state agencies are required to do tribal consultation, which in state government, that's a really formal term, because we have a government to government relationship between the state government and each of the 29 sovereign federally recognized tribes. And so this is important that this consultation is happening on a government to government level, while also it's important that the council and the state agencies are doing engagement with tribes and urban Native communities and with Indigenous populations. And so that just also really needs to be centered in this work. So on the Environmental Justice Council, I think we've talked quite a bit about what they do actually. So I don't know that going into taking the time on this slide is super helpful, because I think we have talked about this. It's supposed to be a conduit between community and the government, and to keep agencies accountable. And so I'm going to speed through this because we really want to have time to hear from you all actually how the council, concrete ways that the council can be more accessible to community. So I'm going to move to the next slide and just quickly talk about who the membership of the council are. I mentioned that the governor, I think I mentioned that these members are not appointed yet. So the governor's office is currently reviewing the applications for the people who have applied to be seated on the council. There will be 7 community representatives, 1 who's a youth representative, 4 members representing tribal communities. And I will just say that just because there's 4 seats set aside for tribal communities does not mean that any of the other 12 seats could not be filled by Indigenous populations. So that's important. There's also 2 environmental justice practitioners or academics, 1 representative of a business regulated by a covered agency, and the covered agencies being the 7 named in the HEAL Act that I mentioned earlier. 1 member of a union representing the building and construction trades, and then 1 representative at large, so a flexible position. And the Environmental Justice Interagency Work Group, I've mentioned this. This is the coming together, the collaboration of the named state agencies. So each agency has 1 member who is on that interagency work group, and we've been meeting for a few months now, just trying to queue things up. So when the council is convened, it can hit the ground running, but the interagency work group is really providing that technical support. They're making sure that the agencies are incorporating environmental justice into decision making, and really, like I had, when I answered that question about trying to get the knowledge from these handful of people hired to implement HEAL out through the whole agencies, that's the work that they're really focusing on. How do we create that culture shift within the agencies? And just to come full circle, we started out with talking about how important working together is, and I'm going to pass it to Elise to sort of pull that all back together.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. So this is a slide with a lot of stuff going on. And I also noticed that in the chat, someone wanted like deadlines of when these different things were. And there's quite a few deadlines. So maybe, Sarah, we can add that deadline piece to our slide deck before we share it out, because we have a slide on that. We just didn't include it today. So that's definitely something we can do. But this slide in a nutshell kind of shows the process and shows like that. I think the main point here is that it's not going to be a linear process. The point of the HEAL Act is to completely restructure and reshape the way that state government is addressing big injustices and big problems. And so it's an iterative process where there's going to be mistakes along the way, but there are these different accountability mechanisms built in throughout the HEAL Act to make sure that as government is doing this work, that we're transparent with communities and that communities have a say in things throughout the course of implementation. And so you can see all these different arrows going forward. And I just want to be really clear, like communities are still at the heart of this, and there are arrows to every group where communities will be influencing the council, the interagency work group, and agencies themselves. And so just get ready to buckle up for an iterative process where we are working to figure out how to best implement this bill using community priorities and guidance. I think next slide. Do you want me to go over this, Sarah, or?
Sure.
Okay. I couldn't remember if this was my slide or your. Oh, this is your slide. I'm taking over your time. I'm so sorry.
Like, sure, take it. That's fine.
Go for it.
I'll just say quickly, I don't want to spend a lot of time reading through these, but I'll just, this top link is for a listserv for the EJ Council. I'd really encourage people to click on that link when we share it out and sign up, because that's where we'll announce, when the council has been seated, our meetings and agendas, and all of the ways that you can engage with the council. There's also a link to the council webpage, the HEAL Act and the bill report, which is like a summary of the HEAL Act and some of the history, as well as the EJ task force report that Elise and Guillermo both mentioned, which is an excellent read and really builds the foundation of this work, and a 2-page summary of the task force recommendations. And we'll share all these links. I can drop them in chat when I stop sharing my screen, and we can also share out the slides. Great, and I think we definitely have some time for questions still, I think. And I did see one about the interaction with federal agencies who are responsible for cleaning up Superfund sites like Hanford. And this is another place that I would love Guillermo and Elise to jump in to talk about the intent there. I'll say the conversations that I've been a part of so far have really been trying to figure out what role the council will have, the EJ Council will have in engaging in that work and having a voice at those tables. And that is without a council seated yet. It's a little bit challenging to figure that out, but that's one of the processes that we're still figuring out is, how can staff, or we'll have 3 staff for the council, how can we help track that stuff and stay engaged, and finding out how the council wants to engage. But I think the state agencies also have a role and have that conduit to the federal government. So I'd love Elise or Guillermo to share thoughts about the intent there.
Yeah, I think that connection might happen just a little more naturally, since like those issues are going to be too hard to ignore. And I don't think the council, being from community, will have any hesitation to give the state recommendation on, how the federal government could maybe be doing better. And, this administration has its environmental justice, what's it called, like NEJA or something? NEJAC.
The National Advisory Council on Environmental Justice.
Yeah, and I know, they were in Washington like a couple of weeks ago and meeting with some members. So like that kind of interaction, I think, is happening. How directly it happens with the council, I think, has yet to be determined. But yeah, I think, like I said, I don't think the council will hesitate to comment on things going on at the federal level too.
Are there any other questions? I also just want to note the time and that we have about 10 minutes left in this session, and I would love for us to get into breakout groups if possible. But Sierra, are there any lingering questions that you want us to answer right now? Okay. And just for you all to know, this will not be your last opportunity to have these discussions. We're peppering them throughout. So if we didn't get to the exact thing that you needed right now, keep bringing it up, and we will throughout the course of the day. And here's our contact information. Definitely feel free to reach out to Sierra or me if you have questions or comments or want to connect.
Also, just a note, if you need to be in a room with closed captioning, please send Lev a direct message, and then we can get into our breakout rooms and start discussing.
Hello.
Hello.
Was that Val?
Yes, this is Val. Sorry,
Hi, Val.
got an active house today, so I'm trying to listen very hard.
Those are my favorite Zoom meetings, actually, people's kids and pets.
Well, I got a lot of them this morning, it feels like. So.
Well, they are very, very welcome. It just brings life into work in a way that I think is really nice, especially when the interactions are online like this.
Oh, definitely.
Hi, Cindy. Hello, Carla. Renee, thank you so much for doing the captioning. And Guillermo, hi.
Hello.
Well, we just happen to have an expert, so I'll be doing the note taking here. What kind of epiphanies or questions or great ideas that do you have that I could capture? I'll show you what I'm capturing them on. So these are all going to go back to Sierra for the environmental justice agenda. So these really matter. They want to gather information to use, Elise as well, and I'm sure it would inform Guillermo's work. So any ideas you have or questions? So the let's see. So the prompts would be, how can the Environmental Justice Council be more accessible? And what ideas do you have for people interacting with the Environmental Justice Council? How can it really meaningfully and effectively engage with communities?
One idea that came to mind for me is making a special effort to reach out to youth and stipending them for their feedback and their time. We keep hearing from youth. I work as a coordinator for one of the youth family system partner roundtables in the region for youth behavioral health. And what we consistently hear from youth is that everybody wants their time, everybody wants their feedback, but nobody wants to give them any compensation for that. Or if they do, it's pizza. So they'd really like to be shown that, you know, their feedback, one is sought out, and two, that it matters.
I will say about, yes, and same thing for community. One, we tried getting council members, and I think we're going to continue to try to get them compensated because it's all volunteer, you know, and like the interagency work group, their staff from state agencies will be paid. It's just that there's state law that prohibits gift of funds, but we really don't see this as a gift of funds. You know, it's community members dedicating their time and expertise, labor. So yeah, I like that. Yeah, and for youth, yeah, coming from college organizing, yes, we need that.
I figure youth are going to be the ones that are dealing with these issues long after I'm gone. So they should definitely have a say in constructing these solutions.
So I don't know if you can see this board. It may not be big, but just let me know if it's not, if you'd like for me to reword these comments. Okay, great. Thanks, Val.
Hi, I'm Carla.
Hey, Carla.
I'm an ND student and almost graduated MPH student from Bastyr. I actually live in White Center, like uphill from South Park. So, you know, all of these environmental issues are also very important to me because I know that I live very close to a super site fund area. And, you know, I know that around here, there's a lot of, a big population that English might not be their first language. And I also work as a medical interpreter. So, you know, for me, language access, I think it's very important for, you know, our communities to keep things accessible. You know, so just always be sure that all the information and all the invitations are made in different languages so different groups can access them. I think that's, for me, it's important as a interpreter and as a, you know, public health person that cares about that kind of thing.
Is that representative, the pink one? And ELL, English language learners. I don't know if that's accurate either. That was the latest guidance I'd gotten.
Yeah, I think, you know, yeah, make things accessible language wise, and also I think educational level wise, because sometimes we forget about, you know, literacy level when we try to explain things when we're really into our subject.
Absolutely. Yeah, we can get deep into our jargon. I work at Harborview sometimes, and all of our information has to be on a 5th grade reading level, and it makes it better. like I'll rework my documents and say, wow, that is so much more clear.
Yeah, sometimes we just try to overdo things, and we sometimes need to keep it simple.
Is there a particular reading level or grade level that you would say based on your experience?
I'm not sure. You know, I think like the 5th level or 7, it's probably between there. It's good for most people, because I know that a lot of people that immigrate, at least from Mexico, they don't have really high educational levels. So there might be concepts that, there might be really common in English for people, like about the environment, that might be not as common in Mexico. Even I immigrated here like in 2011. There were concepts that I had to learn that, we really didn't have in Mexico, some of them. So yeah.
Okay. And also accessibility of concepts, or clear explanations of concepts. I need the closed caption or type of. Okay. Yeah, Cindy.
Hi, Kathleen.
Hi.
So it seems to me that there are a lot more people interested in being part of this movement. And I told so many people about it, and I don't see any of them on the call. So I'm just noticing that as like, how can we incentivize engagement with the council? And kind of looking from the other side of the coin, the question is, how can the council, interact best with the community? Like, it just seems like we really need to be thinking about what are the blocks that are occurring that keep people from even engaging, even though the interest is there. How do we, other than the fact that this is so important, our house is burning, i.e. our world, anyway, that's my thought.
Yeah. I will say, like, even having this on a Saturday, I think is accessible. Having things in the evening, accessible. Like, sometimes these meetings are hosted like between the 9 to 5 block. Like, people don't have time for that. Like, or people don't also want to come home and then get on an 1.5-hour call,
Yeah, it's true. So also, I think there's Zoom burnout too. I think we have to be real about that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're gonna close, but thank you all for being here.
Yes, thank you so much. We're taking back some good ideas.
Well, I have to say, our breakout room went really well, and I'm hoping everybody had a great opportunity to share some ideas. I think the main thing I've taken from this past session is just that the injustice that hits you in the gut and fires you up and makes you want to do something about it and solve this. And it's for the people, by the people of these overburdened communities, and community needs to be at the center of this. Just a couple of quick highlights from my session was accountability. And we talked a lot about this amnesia from one generation to the other, and also about restorative justice. How do we restore the communities that have been already overburdened, as well as preventing future communities? So those are just some of the thoughts. My mind's spinning with a million other ones. So if anyone else would like to hop in and share what happened in their breakout rooms, go right ahead. Kathleen?
Hi, yeah, I just wanted to create a space for Eliza, who is from the Spring Youth Council, who had a great question, I hear.
Yeah, I was just about to type it into the chat, but in our breakout room, we were talking about if other states have like implemented any other environmental justice like laws or bills like the HEAL Act. And then Daniel asked like what can we do to like help those states or like other states get like bills like the HEAL Act?
Thanks, Eliza, for that question. I can take a first pass, and then maybe Guillermo or Sierra, if you want to add to that. So what I'll say is there are other states that do have environmental justice policies. For example, I'd like to specifically call out New Jersey, who has a wonderful policy that they just are starting to implement. I think it also was passed in the last year or two that has make it so that industry that often pollutes these communities, they have to go through this robust set of like community engagement, like very, very, very intensive community engagement process, specifically in the communities that are being targeted by these industries. And then also their equivalent of the department. So we have at the state level, the Department of Ecology that regulates permits for these industries. And in the New Jersey version of that agency, the agency can just squash the permit and say, you didn't engage the community appropriately, or this is going to harm the community too much. You're not getting a permit in our state. And so I think that is a really transformational policy. In terms of, California also has a number of great policies, but I'll say in terms of what the HEAL Act does, that is not something that we've seen across any other state government. This is really trying to think about at a systems level, how we restructure how state government runs and operates, so that we can get into like the EJ issues that matter most to communities and are affecting communities most. I have not seen that at a state level, but I know that other states are looking to Washington and are very interested in how the HEAL Act goes. And maybe in the future, we'll see some replication.
Nothing to add on my end. That was perfect. Yeah. And it's always, that's a good question because Eliza, every legislator always asks that. They're like, do other states have this? Because they usually don't want to be the first ones to do something. They want to see other people like go through it and like work it out. Yeah, good question.
This is Daniel Van Arsdale. I want to kind of lift Eliza up. She was the co-facilitator in the spring for the Youth Council in our Health and Climate Change Conference and just did a phenomenal job. And as you can see, she still continues to do a phenomenal job. And I'm hoping she decides to be a future Bastyrian, but she's a high school freshman. So we'll work on her for a few years here. But thank you so much, Eliza, as always, just phenomenal.
And agreed on all of that. And thank you to our presenters for really pushing our brains to really think deeply and critically about these issues and get us talking to each other, sharing our ideas, because this all comes from the community. And on that note, I invite everybody to get up, take a little walk, drink some water, get some fresh air, and we'll take a short break. And let's try to hop back in 5 to 10 minutes.